I'm Jo Riddle, the creator, executive producer, and host of the HAPI podcast. The Human Architecture and Planning Institute, also known as the HAPI, is dedicated to understanding the human experience in the built environment and improving its design through education and research. On our podcast, we interview interdisciplinary professionals in fields spanning neuroscience, urban planning, psychology, and the business world for expert insights that illuminate our human nature. Today we have special guest Vernon Woodworth III, who is a registered architect teaching at the Boston Architectural College and is the secretary of the Human Architecture and Planning Institute based in Boston, Massachusetts. Thanks for joining us today, Vernon.
Thank you, Joanna. Pleasure to be here.
I know that there may be a potential publication coming up, and I would love to hear your thoughts on maybe some things that you're working on that you're excited about.
Yes, there are 3 editors assigned to a Routledge Handbook for Neuroscience and Architecture, all 3 of whom happen to be board members of the HAPI. But essentially, we are trying to introduce the realm of the human response to environmental conditions as understood in its deepest senses, i.e. the central nervous system and the other systems of cognition and memory, to the practice of architecture so that we can design environments that more fully suit our biology. It's also multidisciplinary, so not just neuroscientists and not just neuroscientists and architects.
When you have a neuroscientist contributing alongside maybe an interior designer, maybe a marketer or business person, when they are in the same room, either literally or metaphorically, do you feel like those connections are often intuitive and how they relate to each other, or that there's a lot of learning that's been taking place between bringing this book together?
There's been an enormous amount of learning that's been taking place. The Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture just turned 20 years old, and it was commented at their most recent convention that the conversation has finally begun to energize both parties, i.e. there's always been an interesting connection, but there's been a difficulty in reaching common ground. And the sense is that that's less of an obstacle. If I could just switch to a little bit of theory, I think one of the main interests that the HAPI has is in the role of anxiety versus a sense of well-being, and that will be a theme in this book. And for that, monitoring cortisol levels and monitoring stress is a key component. One of the contributors to the volume, Cleo Valentine, will be writing about her findings of stress inducement in the built environment and how this affects cognitive functioning. If we look into the cause of other diseases, from type 2 diabetes to cancer and even Alzheimer's, stress is a major factor in each of these. So the health implications of this research, I think, really need to be emphasized.
Definitely. And there's even, quantifiably, you can gauge someone's stress response based on, the heart rate monitor or the galvanic skin response, and kind of broaden it into the implications down the road of what do the long-term public health aspects of this look like, it sounds like you're saying.
Absolutely. Absolutely, yes. I was just reading about an experiment, not an experiment, but research that was done in hospital settings where accidental deaths caused by wrong treatments could be traced to audio characteristics of hospital settings. In other words, the poor acoustics, the constant loudspeaker announcements, difficulty understanding one another can directly be shown to have mortality results in hospital settings. Mm-hmm. Another example is a mural painted on a wall in a prison facility that could be shown to increase mood and reduce stress of prison guards. So there's implications across many different building types and uses.
You have, I think, a master's in theology from the Divinity School at Harvard, I think.
Yes, correct.
Um, and I am bringing that up because I think that this will help shape not only the interdisciplinary part of our conversation, but also that kind of like unconscious influence in the visual audio world. If you wouldn't mind speaking maybe more to how those things kind of connected for you in whatever capacity, that would be very interesting.
At the time that I got my degree in divinity, I was pursuing a career in psychology and was very interested in the role of of theology and anthropology in understanding human culture. But neuroscience is a relatively new dimension to that interest for me, and I'm finding people such as Julio Bermudez who have been working in this area for years. Um, they have done studies in sacred environments and then in non-sacred environments to determine the different impacts. I think it's pretty clear that one of the roles that religious architecture performs universally is the regulation of our central nervous system. There's a social dimension to that, but there's an aesthetic dimension to that. And ultimately, it's an emotional process of letting down one's defenses and allowing a sense of calmness and well-being to emerge, which is what any architectural environment can do. But we've lost that skill, it seems, to a large extent.
Mm-hmm. I love this comment because I think that if you were to say that to anyone, like, oh, there's a different environmental experience in what you termed as sacred buildings, it's like a temple or a mosque. Um, I even start thinking about the acoustics, so how it's designed acoustically to resonate and reverberate with like the different tonalities of the choir. I think I would love to hear, based as you as an architect, for our listeners at home, how someone and why someone would design, like, say, a library with maybe a glass facade versus a cathedral with stone. And like, granted, like we can take history into play in this. Like, we didn't design these overnight, but there is definitely intention there. And I would love to hear more about where you think that intention comes from and how it shapes maybe our unconscious perception of these places.
Well, my first thought is the work of Johannes Palasma, The Eyes of the Skin, and his criticism of our current cultural and intellectual preference for visual understanding. He feels that that's created a separation of our sense of ourselves and our experiences from the world around us, and that really our acoustic connection and our haptic connection, the sense of touch, are fundamental to the human experience and to the functioning of the central nervous system. So the cathedral clearly, and I have less experience with other religious buildings, but the cathedral certainly has this enormous emotional impact based on its acoustic qualities. There's obviously an equal amount of emphasis on visual stimulation, and um, the ritual dimension can't be overlooked, but it's where culture performs what I think is ultimately a healing process that connects us once again to a sense of community and purpose.
Definitely. I know that's a lot to unpack in just a few
Yeah,
sentences.
yeah.
um, yeah, because my mind is wandering to what are those rituals and how do we practice and why do we practice?
Yeah, so, from the first cities 10,000 years ago, we've been evolving cultural mechanisms for creating homeostasis in terms of balance, but we still have this deep emotional need for a connection and a sense of belonging. If you've seen the traditional city squares of culture with deeper history than we have here in North America, you know that there was a sense that they were creating spaces to essentially provide a sense of meaning to all the members of the community. I don't think the modern football stadium fits the bill. I'll just say that.
Mm-hmm.
Although it does, obviously, for many.
But I do know that it's a source of pride and cultural influence for sure.
Yes. Oh, absolutely.
Probably its fun.
But it's also manipulated. I think the manipulation of our human tendencies for commercial purposes is a real issue, and that's happened to architecture. It threatens the very fabric of the society, ultimately.
Let's unpack that because that is not a direction I thought we would go in, but I totally agree.
Well, let's just talk about eye tracking. Here's a process whereby we can determine what we're attracted to, how long we will pay attention to something, and all of the implications of that for emotion and behavior. Who uses eye tracking? The commercial companies checking on website effectiveness. Car companies use eye tracking to a great extent, but the design professions don't use it. And so the public realm is not benefiting from the advantage of facilitating engagement and connection, whereas the commercial world is intent on exploiting this technology. What I have a difficulty with is an enormous football stadium surrounded by acres of parking, viewed from a blimp with a bombardment of advertisements.
There's
That to
Gillette,
me
right?
doesn't feel like a culturally valuable experience.
Yes. Yeah, Gillette Stadium comes to mind. Yeah, for sure. And I probe the baseball part of this because I know Worcester, Massachusetts just added a new baseball field, and they're even kind of taking on the Red Sox name a little bit, so that transference of cultural identity. But yeah, I
Well, it's
think that
enormously valuable, and cities want franchises to the extent that they'll sacrifice enormous income to draw them. And it's more about identity than it is about economics, although that's a part of it.
definitely that is true because I think that identity can drive economics, right?
Yes. And that I think is one of the key issues here. Placemaking and identity are
Mm-hmm.
related. Placemaking is something everybody responds to, but it's not the same as being in a place, dwelling.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll just emphasize the word being because I think being, what goes into being, what it is to be, is overlooked in our rush to achieve other experiences and material wealth.
Which I think is also a very American experience to be
Mm-hmm.
kind of capitally driven,
Oh,
if I
yeah.
may say. I like that you said that everyone responds to identity and placemaking. Does everyone participate in placemaking and identity, and either voluntarily or not?
I think everybody can. Now, I
Mm.
do wonder, because obviously so many Americans go from their suburban single family to the highway to the office park or the strip mall. What does that mean for them? What are the long-term implications of that? No casual encounters on a street with interesting shops or uh, openings to plazas with monumental buildings.
Hmm. I will say, because I visited the Midwest and it's just dystopian, right? The way that there's just so many copy paste neighborhoods and parks and whatever. And I do think maybe at that point it ends up being the people that work there that are those identifiers, other than maybe a grid system, right? It's like a numerical street value of identity in place, or the Capitol building, for example. Like creates those identities when there's a dissolution, I guess, of physical nodes.
Yeah. So I think, the state of Florida will illustrate well, but also in Boston, we recently developed an entire neighborhood called the Seaport that has no sense of place. I think it's fair to say. And although viewed perhaps as a commercial success, uh, does not enhance the public realm. Now that
No.
there's exceptions to that because there is the Museum of Contemporary Art and there's talk of building a park there. But to a large extent, I think it was a question of maximizing the value of this untapped resource and not about culture building.
Yeah, that's interesting. I feel like maybe that is kind of a product of intellectualizing places, right? Because like
Mhm.
they have the convention center, they also have in the same like 2 blocks, what's it called? Like a concert venue. So it's like here we have placed intentional spaces for these specific things to happen, but I
Yes,
think that disregards organic growth in any
right.
capacity or attraction even to like small businesses. So it's kind of like it's intended to be some kind of incubator because it is a really lucrative space. I won't lie.
Yes.
Like it's very coastal, it's beautiful, it's very close to the city. But they've almost seemingly overthought it, or again, like just led with the capitalistic view, I guess, or
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
commercial view.
It's definitely formulaic.
Hmm.
I will say there's some good restaurants there, so it's not like I never go there. And
So
I
there's some
enjoy
living
the music
qualities.
tent.
Yeah. Well, at least there's that. At least
Yes.
Seaport has that much.
So you were asking about the unconscious earlier,
Mhm.
and I think in relationship to religion, but I think that currently the preference is to use the term non-conscious, and that unpacks the baggage of 100 years of psychoanalysis and so forth. But when we say non-conscious, we're talking about all of the neurons firing that do not reach the frontal cortex. Our sensory systems are constantly monitoring the world around us. Not everything reaches consciousness. We're not aware of it. If you really dedicate yourself to the question of what am I feeling right now, I find that it's a little bit difficult and B, not always possible to put a name on it. But the more you do it, it becomes a practice.
Mhm.
The problem is sometimes our upbringings, our culture, our job situations, or life in general convince us that it's more effective to overlook what we're feeling right now. And the technical term for that is dissociation, which is recognized as a source of pathology and depression and could be construed as essentially losing track of what it means to be alive. So part of the current neuroscience interest for architects is based on the findings of mirror neurons and mirror mechanisms, those parts of the brain that are constantly relating to the world around us through our bodies. It's known that if you were to pick up a banana right now or a handful of peanuts and start eating it, I would have the experience of eating peanuts or a banana watching you. And that's true of our ancestors, the apes, as well. This extends to watching a performance, dance, perhaps boxing. It could even explain the attraction of some of these activities and the ability to feel your way into the world around you through attentive, embodied consciousness
Mhm.
can counteract the effects of dissociation. So if we do that, uh, we are much more alive in a sense. We're connecting to more of our systems in the central nervous system. And we're also experiencing more. We can have more in-depth relationships with others. If we don't do that, if we can't do that based on poor parenting, uh, a in inappropriate educational settings, blank facades. I'm now extending this to the environment, long freeways, acres of parking. We dissociate. We no longer have access to that part of our being, and our lives are going to be the poorer for it, and we'll probably be less healthy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of spectrum to the things that you mentioned, and in terms of like neurodiversity, in terms of uh, environmental composition.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and I would say something that you reminded me of with the mirror neurons that I think is exhibited quite candidly is in babies when they're learning. I think it's called motherese
Mm-hmm.
when your child watches your face or your activity and does the same thing, or like just learns by watching you and copying what you do.
Yes.
And so I think that that's a really good baseline, like I guess even psychologically, of where we come from.
The research on that reveals that that process of interaction actually wires the infant's brain.
Mm-hmm.
And I compare it to what in engineering is called commissioning. So you built a boat and you put it in the water, but you've got to make sure all the systems are in order. You're installing the navigation and the communications uh, and wiring. So you tweak it, you test it. Every infant born is undeveloped emotionally, but has the instinctive urge to connect with a primary parent. And in that connection, to establish interpersonal dynamics, and that activates emotional neurons and forms the personality. This is well established, but we haven't applied it in any way to our cultural practices, so that most of us end up in therapy ultimately. But therapy occurs in a world that has lost touch with that sense of interaction and reciprocity. And so we talk about mirror neurons, but in therapy, we talk about mirroring. If you
Mm-hmm.
feel mirrored, if you feel affirmed, your self-worth is going to increase, blood flow to your brain is going to increase, your creativity is going to increase.
Mm-hmm.
The environment can be part of the solution here to the dissociation and alienation that lack of mirroring has
Mm-hmm.
caused.
I think to contribute to your point and also related to the research, some students at Tufts and I did, I read a research paper when we were comparing people's either conscious or non-conscious responses to vehicles. And one of the papers that I read talked about eye contact that's made between pedestrians and drivers I forget the exact statistics, but if they made contact with the driver, they were more likely to cross after having that initial connection versus when they weren't. And I'm sure that anyone who's driven a car before can also speak to kind of like the isolating experience, almost like being behind a computer. Like maybe sometimes you'll say things that you wouldn't say in real life.
Mhm.
And I've gotten more road ragey from my car than I have in real life ever. So
Mhm. Mhm.
I think that it would be interesting to hear maybe your perspective on how the environmental difference maybe between having like your own vessel in a car versus a communal experience in a bigger building.
Well, I don't think I'm exactly answering your question right off the bat, but one of
That's
my
okay.
first thoughts is that one of the chapters in our neuroscience and the built environment book is likely to be titled "Cars Are Large Animals." So
Mm-hmm.
we're essentially all animals, right? Some animals are bigger than others, and bigger animals tend to threaten smaller animals. If you're in a car, you have become a big animal.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're walking across the street, you are a smaller animal. So it's almost required evolutionary behavior to fear the large animal.
Mm-hmm.
All right. As far as the difference in social connection, I mean, I took public transportation today. I didn't talk to anybody or have any meaningful eye contact with anybody. So I don't think that there's a simple solution there. And even when you're walking down a street, connection is very rare. But our animal self understands that we're people and those are people walking past us. And, we might be curious about them. People watching is a universal
Mhm.
activity for our species, which is why outdoor cafes are so successful. And that kind of casual interaction can have far more impact on our central nervous system than I think we fully recognize. That's not going to happen on a highway, even if you're stopped in traffic.
That's super interesting. I know in the Boston area, for anyone listening, that they've been piloting road closures in very heavily trafficked parts of Cambridge, um, to kind of pilot this people first way of living. And there's definitely been contrasting views on both sides because it impacts people that live there as residents and also impacts people that visit there for leisure or recreation. So I guess, Verna, I would love to know what you think maybe we could find as compromises, either in a literal design of a place or maybe it's a reduction of something else. I'm sure it's going to be multifaceted, any kind of solution like this, but based on what you've seen or maybe research that you've done or are passionate about, how do you see us prioritizing people in a realistic way in the future?
I'm a huge fan of bike paths,
Mhm.
and cities are, painting stripes and creating bike paths in streets. But we also have opportunities to think beyond that to bike paths that are isolated from other vehicles
Mhm.
or appropriate for pedestrians and bikes.
Mhm.
Um, if you have a path that you can walk on regularly to get to shopping, work, or just to recreate and exercise, you're going to be a happier, healthier human being. That's straight fact.
Research backed, straight facts. I think it's also interesting that you bring up Newbury Street because for anyone that hasn't been there, I think it's just all one-way streets and it's just one, it could fit, I think, just one car, not even two, going in both directions. And culturally, as a Bostonian, pedestrians are a lot more ballsy to cross the street. Like they won't wait, which I think is an interesting reclamation. And you see this all over Boston that people will
Mhm.
cross, at any advantageous point. But specifically Newbury Street, because I think it's one lane, because it's like cobblestone too. I like those design factors, which are more European based, I would say, than American based, based on their design. People, I see people reclaiming those streets specifically more often
Mhm.
than I do in other parts of the city. Definitely.
Yeah. So, what is it about Newbury Street? It's the width of the street. It's the width of the sidewalks.
Mm-hmm.
It's the density of the economic activity, but it's
Totally.
also mixed use. There's residences above the storefronts. Um, but it also is a battleground. So if you want to park on Newbury Street, you're going to have to block somebody else while you wait for somebody to get out of the spot and then back into it. I recently was on Exeter, I think, wanting to turn onto Newbury Street. Car stops in the middle of the road, all the doors open. People get out, go back in for their bags. I'm like, what is going
Yeah.
on? They felt entitled to do that. It was, and so it's the same dynamic going on with pedestrians crossing, jaywalking to, get diagonally across the street rather than crossing at the crosswalk.
Yeah.
Um,
And to contrast that even with near I would say Boston Common or even Trinity Church, like there are these really central hubs with a lot going on, but the roads are huge. And
mhm,
so it's definitely, I would say, in terms of traveling, a car first oriented environment. And again, you were kind of speaking to this, the width of the road, the size of the sidewalks, the density of the businesses around there definitely play a role into that.
mhm. But those are good notes. Kevin
Mm.
Lynch was the brilliant urban planner,
Mhm.
designer who identified different typologies of urban uh, fabric. and nodes, landmarks, neighborhoods, boundaries, edges. I think I've messed up a little bit there. I know there's 5 of them, and we need those to make sense. And this brings us back to neuroscience. If we have an expectation to orient ourselves according to paths, nodes, and landmarks, and those expectations are met, we will have a sense of comfort. We will have our wayfinding will be improved. And when we don't feel lost, we feel a lot safer.
Thank you for joining us for this week's episode of the HAPI podcast. For more information on our work or becoming HAPI certified, please visit our website at www.thehapi.org.